I was halfway through making dinner, stirring the sauce the way my grandmother used to, when I heard the front door open. You know when the energy in a room just shifts? That's exactly what happened. Ryan walked in looking like he had practiced sadness in the rearview mirror. His shoulders were drooped in this overly dramatic way, and I could almost feel something wrong before he said a single word. I turned toward him with this tiny knot forming in my stomach, hoping it was just work stress. But deep down, some part of me already knew it wasn't. He gave this deep, heavy sigh, the kind people use when they want you to brace yourself, and said, "Laura, we need to talk." My heart dropped first, and my spoon hit the edge of the pan second. I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel, trying to keep my voice steady. When I asked what was wrong, he wouldn't even look me in the eyes. That hurt more than anything he said afterward. His voice came out thin, almost rehearsed, like he'd written the lines earlier. And then he dropped it, the request that would wreck my week. "I need time to find myself," he said, as if he were some wandering philosopher rather than the guy who'd spent 3 years eating my homemade lasagna. I just stared at him, confused and blindsided, feeling my chest tighten in that slow, painful way. He insisted it wasn't about me. He claimed he needed space, no labels, no pressure, like he was freeing himself from a job he hated. I tried to understand, tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. And that night, when I finally cried myself to sleep, I still believed he was genuinely struggling, even though part of me wondered why his struggle felt so one-sided. The next morning felt strange, like waking up in a house that wasn't mine anymore. His absence echoed louder than any argument we'd ever had. I kept replaying his words in my head, trying to squeeze meaning out of a sentence that felt hollow. I made coffee the way I always do, but even the smell felt different, almost heavier. Part of me kept checking my phone, hoping he'd message something, anything, that made sense. But the silence became its own answer, and that answer hurt more than I wanted to admit. I tried distracting myself with work, but my mind drifted back to every moment we'd shared, searching for signs I might have missed. Had he been pulling away slowly? Had I mistaken distance for stress? You know that feeling when you rewatch your memories with new eyes? That's what I did, over and over, picking apart conversations like puzzle pieces that no longer fit. And yet, even with all that searching, I still felt lost, like he had slammed a door I didn't see coming. Every hour stretched longer than the last. By the end of the week, I was exhausted from pretending I was fine. Everyone kept telling me he'd come around, that he just needed air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. His words didn't match his tone, and his tone didn't match the man I thought I knew. Still, I held on to the version of him I loved, hoping this break was what he truly needed. I tried respecting the space he'd asked for, even though it felt like I was the only one standing still in the middle of it. And that's when life decided to show me exactly what kind of break he had really taken. By the time the weekend rolled around, I felt like I was walking through my own life on autopilot. I kept going through the motions, laundry, meal prep, tidying the living room, trying to convince myself that normal was still possible. But every quiet moment turned into a reminder of what he'd said. And honestly, the silence in the apartment felt heavier than his presence ever had. I kept wondering who he was without me and why he suddenly needed a version of life that didn't include us. That question sat in my chest like a stubborn knot. At night, I'd lie in bed replaying the look on his face. How distant it seemed, how rehearsed it felt. It was like he'd made up his mind before I even had a chance to ask why. And yet, I held on to the hope that his finding himself meant soul-searching, not running away. I tried to picture him journaling in some coffee shop, reading self-help books, maybe finally facing his emotions, the kind of healing journey you see in movies. But deep down, something whispered that his story didn't look anything like that. I just wasn't ready to listen to that voice yet. Still, I promised myself I'd give him the space he asked for, even if it tore something inside me. I kept telling myself that love sometimes meant stepping back, trusting someone enough to let them sort their life out. I didn't know then that what I was offering, patience, loyalty, faith, was the last thing he deserved. Because while I was here holding on to us, he was out there making choices that would shatter everything I thought I knew. And soon, I'd see exactly what he was really doing with all that time to find himself. A week later, Naomi practically dragged me out for coffee, insisting I needed sunlight and human contact before I turned into a houseplant. I agreed because she was right. I'd been hiding behind chores and quiet rooms for days. The cafe smelled like roasted beans and warm pastries, the kind of scent that usually comforts me. But that day, even the sweetness in the air felt muted. Naomi chatted about random things, trying to make me laugh, and I appreciated the effort more than she knew. I just didn't realize life was about to punch me in the gut before the latte even cooled. We were walking back toward the parking lot when we passed a bar with outdoor seating. At first, I wasn't even looking at the people, just trying to breathe through another heavy moment. But then Naomi stopped so suddenly I bumped into her shoulder. She didn't say a word, just tilted her head toward a table near the railing. And that's when I saw him. Ryan. Laughing. Relaxed. And with his arm casually wrapped around a woman I'd never seen in my life. My heart didn't just drop, it crashed. For a second, I swear the world blurred, like someone had wiped a hand across the lens of my reality. I whispered his name because my brain refused to believe what my eyes already knew. Naomi turned to me with fury in her face, this protective anger only true friends have. She said he looked very found to her, and that scraped something raw inside me. I stood there trembling, replaying every word he'd fed me about space and self-discovery. And there he was, discovering someone else while I was still trying to make sense of our breakup. The betrayal hit so sharp it nearly took the air from my lungs. I felt my hands go cold first, then the shaking started, this soft, uncontrollable tremor that climbed up my arms. It was the kind of shock that makes you forget how to stand, how to breathe, how to even exist in your own body. I kept staring at them, frozen, hoping maybe I was misunderstanding the situation. Maybe she was a coworker, a cousin, anyone but what she clearly was. But then he leaned in closer to her, whispering something in her ear, and she laughed in that effortless way women laugh when they feel chosen. That's when the truth finally landed, and it hurt like nothing I'd ever felt before. Naomi put a steadying hand on my back, grounding me before I completely unraveled on the sidewalk. She kept saying, "Laura, don't you dare blame yourself for this." But my mind was already spiraling. I replayed the conversation from that night, his sigh, his distant eyes, his practiced lines about self-discovery. And suddenly, it all made sense in the most disgusting way. "He asked for space," I whispered, my voice breaking in the middle. "He said he needed time." Naomi stiffened beside me, anger radiating off her like heat. "Yeah," she said. "Apparently his space came with lipstick and a bar tab." And something shifted inside me right then. Not a scream, not a sob, but a clarity that cut sharper than grief. I realized I'd spent a week mourning a relationship he'd already thrown away long before he said the words out loud. The shock didn't vanish, but it rearranged itself into a different shape, something steadier, something awake. It was like a veil had been ripped off, and I finally saw him for who he was, not who I'd been loving. And in that moment, as painful as it was, a spark of strength started growing in the cracks he left behind. I kept watching them, almost as if my brain needed visual proof to process the betrayal. The way he leaned back in his chair, relaxed, carefree, like the past 3 years meant nothing, burned deeper than I can explain. She touched his arm lightly, and he didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't act like a man who was finding himself. He acted like a man who had already moved on. And standing there on that sidewalk, I felt the version of him I'd been grieving crumble into dust. It was brutal, but it was clarifying. Painful truths always are. Naomi stepped in front of me then, gently taking my face in her hands the way a sister would. "Laura," she said softly, "look at me, not at him." And for the first time since I spotted him, I pulled my eyes away. The anger in her expression wasn't wild or loud. It was protective, intentional, the kind of anger that fights for you when you can't fight for yourself. I swallowed hard, trying to hold myself together in the middle of a sidewalk packed with strangers. But inside, something was shifting. The heartbreak was still there, but it wasn't drowning me anymore. It was sharpening into something else. When we finally turned to walk away, I felt a strange mix of devastation and awakening pooling inside me. I thought I'd be sobbing, collapsing, begging for the truth, but instead, I felt steadier with each step. It's like my heart realized it had been holding onto a lie and was finally letting it go. And while the betrayal still stung like fresh skin under cold air, a new kind of resolve started forming. A quiet voice whispering that this wasn't the end of my story with him. Not like this. And definitely not on his terms. I don't know what came over me, but something inside me snapped into place the moment I turned back toward that bar. Not in a chaotic way, more like a calm storm settling over my shoulders. You know that strange, quiet bravery that shows up when you least expect it? That's exactly what I felt. My heartbeat was steady, my steps deliberate, like my body had decided it was done being blindsided. Naomi tried to grab my wrist, whispering my name like a warning, but I just gave her a look that told her I needed to do this. For me. When I walked up to the table, Ryan's face drained so fast it was almost satisfying. His smile melted into panic, his shoulders tensed, and suddenly he couldn't figure out what to do with his hands. He looked like a kid caught stealing candy, except this wasn't candy. This was my trust, our relationship, everything he claimed he needed space from. I could feel the other woman's eyes on me, confused but curious, waiting for him to explain why his past had just arrived in heels. And for the first time, I didn't feel small standing in front of him. I felt in control. He stuttered out my name, asking what I was doing there, like the universe had broken its rules by exposing his lie. I leaned in a little, giving him a smile that wasn't warm or forgiving, just honest. You said you needed to find yourself, I told him. Looks like you found someone else instead. The woman blinked, turning to him slowly, and I watched the realization wash over her. She pulled her hand from his arm with this subtle disgust, like she'd just touched something contaminated. And there it was, the first crack in the little fantasy world he'd built. The woman looked at me, then back at Ryan, and I could see the confusion turning into something sharper. Betrayal, recognizing betrayal. Ryan, who is she? She asked, her voice low but steady. He opened and closed his mouth like he was trying to pick the least incriminating lie, but every option he had was already burning. She's my ex, he finally blurted out, his voice cracking. We're on a break. Hearing him reduce our relationship to a technicality he twisted for convenience nearly made me laugh. And honestly, I think a piece of me did. Before he could spin the story further, I cut him off. A break you begged for so you could cheat without feeling guilty, I said, loud enough that people at nearby tables started looking over. His cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with the panic of being exposed. The woman leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, suddenly seeing him exactly the way I now did. There was no anger in my voice, just truth. Pure, unembellished truth that hit harder than any scene I could have caused. And for the first time, he couldn't talk his way out of it. The murmurs around us grew, little ripples of judgment spreading through the patio. Some people pretended not to stare, but their eyes lingered long enough to sting his pride. He reached for the woman's hand again, desperate, but she pulled away like he was radioactively toxic. I could see the fallout beginning right there at the table, his facade crumbling, his confidence shrinking, his lies collapsing under the weight of reality. And watching it unfold, I felt a strange sense of clarity settle deeper into me. This wasn't the man I'd been grieving. This was the man I was finally seeing. Ryan kept glancing around like he was searching for an escape route, but there wasn't one. Not this time. Laura, can we just talk about this privately? He whispered, like lowering his voice could somehow shrink the truth. I shook my head slowly, not out of anger, but out of disbelief that he still thought he could control the narrative. You made this public the moment you traded honesty for convenience, I told him. His jaw tightened, but he didn't dare argue. He knew I was right, and the whole patio knew it too. The woman stood up then, fixing her dress with this calm precision that made her look powerful, not embarrassed. She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and solidarity, two women realizing they'd both been lied to by the same man. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly, and that small acknowledgement hit me harder than I expected. Ryan tried to reach for her, but she took a step back and shook her head. "You told me you were single," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You didn't need space. You needed an audience." And with that, she walked away. He turned back to me, defeated in a way I'd never seen before. Not humbled, just caught, exposed, stripped of the story he'd been hiding behind. And as I stood there, watching the consequences circle him like vultures, something inside me settled. I didn't need to raise my voice or cry or demand answers he'd never give truthfully. I had all the clarity I needed. So I stepped back, letting the weight of his choices hang heavy in the air. And as Naomi joined me, guiding me away from the table, a new thought began forming, quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. When I walked away from that bar, I didn't feel like the woman who had been crying into her pillow a week earlier. Something inside me had shifted, almost like a spine snapping back into alignment after years of being bent the wrong way. Naomi kept glancing at me, probably expecting me to fall apart, but the truth is, I felt strangely steady. Not numb, not detached. Just awake in a way I hadn't been in a long time. Betrayal has a funny way of lighting up every dark corner of your intuition, and mine was blazing. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I barely tasted, replaying everything with fresh eyes. The lies, the distance, the rehearsed speech about finding himself, and then the image of him at that bar, relaxed and carefree, like he'd never once considered the cost of his choices. I felt the familiar ache of hurt, but layered beneath it was something else, something sharper, cleaner, a sense of purpose rising from the wreckage. I wasn't interested in destroying him, but I was done protecting him from the truth of who he really was. Ryan had always cared about his image more than anything else. He'd ironed shirts twice to impress his boss, rehearsed presentations until midnight, obsessed over how people perceived him. And that's when the idea slipped into my mind like a quiet visitor. His promotion, something he'd bragged about for months, was still hanging in the air, waiting to be finalized, and his company didn't play around with dishonesty or ethical concerns. I opened my phone, scrolling through our messages, his "I need space" texts, the dates, the timeline, the photos Naomi had taken without him noticing. I didn't smile, but I didn't hesitate either. Naomi sat across from me, watching the quiet storm gather behind my eyes. She didn't interrupt. She knows me well enough to recognize when my silence isn't sadness anymore. It's calculation. "Laura," she finally said, leaning forward, "what are you thinking?" I lifted my phone and showed her the screenshots. The dates, the messages, the proof sitting there like a neatly wrapped truth bomb. Her eyebrows shot up, not in shock, but in approval. "If he wanted to play games," I said, my voice steady, "I'll finish them." She exhaled, equal parts impressed and relieved that I wasn't collapsing under the weight of betrayal. "What are you going to do?" she asked, though I think she already had an idea. I opened the HR department's anonymous tip line, the one Ryan himself had told me existed for ethical concerns. Irony really is a beautiful thing. Then I attached everything, the timeline, the screenshots, Naomi's photos of him draped around another woman while claiming he needed solitude. I didn't exaggerate anything. I didn't invent a single detail. I just handed the truth over to the people who needed to see it most. But I didn't stop there. Ryan's boss was old school, the kind of man who valued integrity the same way others value oxygen. I knew exactly how he'd react to an employee lying to a partner, manipulating emotions, misrepresenting his circumstances, all while representing the company. So I sent the same package to his inbox, clean and anonymous. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't pound. There was a strange calmness pulsing through me, like I was finally stepping into the version of myself I'd been too gentle to embrace. And as I hit send, I felt a shift, like the universe had just clicked into a new gear. After sending everything, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the stillness settle around me. It wasn't triumph I felt, Nothing loud or vengeful. It was clarity, pure and simple. The kind that settles in your bones when you finally stop carrying someone else's lies. I looked around my living room, the same space where I had cried, questioned myself, doubted my worth. But that night, it felt different. Like I had reclaimed it. Like I had reclaimed myself. And for the first time in days, I felt the room breathe with me instead of against me. Naomi reached over and squeezed my hand, not with pity, but with pride. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly, and I believed her in a way I couldn't have a week earlier. Betrayal doesn't just break you, it forces you to see what you've been tolerating, what you've been shrinking yourself for. And suddenly, every moment where I'd put his comfort above my peace came rushing back. Not to haunt me, but to remind me that this was a turning point. A before and after moment I wasn't going to forget. As the night grew quieter, I realized revenge wasn't really the point of any of this. It wasn't about hurting him. It was about refusing to let him walk away spotless while I carried the weight of his choices. It was about restoring balance, even if he never saw it coming. I stood up, poured the rest of my tea down the sink, and felt a steadiness rise in me, warm, grounded, familiar. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. His break was about to collide with reality in a way he never expected, and I was finally ready to face what came after. A week after I sent everything, there was a pounding at my door. Loud, frantic, the kind that rattles the frame and shoots adrenaline straight into your veins. I wasn't expecting anyone, so my first thought was that something was wrong in the building. But then I heard his voice. Ryan. Angry, breathless, desperate. I took a slow sip of the tea I'd just made, the steam brushing against my face like a reminder to stay calm. When I opened the door, he was standing there with wild eyes, like the truth had finally hunted him down. And honestly, it had. He shoved past me without waiting for permission, pacing the living room like a man cornered by his own choices. "Did you send those photos?" he shouted, his voice cracking between rage and panic. "I got suspended. My promotion is gone." He said it like I had betrayed him, like he was the victim in a story he wrote himself. I stayed by the kitchen counter, cup in hand, watching him flail, watching him unravel. There was something almost surreal about seeing the consequences he never believed would touch him finally catch up. I took another sip before answering, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it. "Oh? I thought you were finding yourself," I said, my voice calm in a way that clearly infuriated him. "Looks like you found consequences instead." His face twisted, red with frustration, because he couldn't steer this narrative anymore. He couldn't charm his way out. He couldn't guilt his way through, not with me, not after everything. And standing there, watching him panic in the ruins he created, I felt a strange, grounded peace settle into my chest, steady, unwavering, overdue. He stopped pacing long enough to glare at me, eyes filled with this wild mix of blame and desperation. "You ruined my life," he shouted, as if the words could somehow rewrite what he'd done. I tilted my head, studying him the way you study a stranger who looks vaguely familiar. "No, Ryan," I said quietly. "You ruined ours the day you traded honesty for convenience." The words landed harder than any raised voice ever could. I watched them hit him, watched his posture deflate just a little. Because deep down, he knew it too. His anger cracked, giving way to something smaller, weaker. "I made a mistake," he said, voice trembling as he sank onto the edge of the couch we once shared. "Please, can we just start over?" And for a moment I saw a flash of the man I used to love, vulnerable, scared, reaching for something familiar. But that version of him didn't exist anymore. He'd buried it himself. Maybe he thought I'd fold the way I used to, soften, soothe, patch the holes he carved into us. But heartbreak has a way of teaching you your worth, especially when someone tries to erase it. I walked toward him, not close enough to comfort, just close enough to be seen clearly. "You needed space," I reminded him, my tone steady. "And now you have all the space in the world." His chin quivered, but I didn't waver. "Get off my porch." The words came out firm, almost gentle, because I wasn't fueled by rage anymore. I was fueled by self-respect, by clarity, by the understanding that letting him back in would only reopen wounds I'd just begun to heal. And for the first time, he realized the door he thought he could always walk through was closing. He stood slowly, like the weight of everything he'd lost had finally settled onto his shoulders. For a second, he opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, to bargain, to cling to whatever remnants of control he thought he had. But nothing came out. Not a single excuse. Not a single lie. Just silence. The kind that exposes a man far more than any confession ever could. I stepped back, giving him space to leave, and something in his expression cracked. Maybe dignity. Maybe denial. Maybe the last piece of the illusion he'd been living in. When he finally walked out my door, I didn't slam it. I didn't lock it dramatically or collapse behind it. I just closed it with a quiet click, like closing a chapter that had already ended long before either of us admitted it. I leaned against the wood for a moment, not to steady myself, but to acknowledge the strange, gentle calm blooming in my chest. The apartment felt lighter. My breathing felt easier. It was like my whole life had exhaled with me, releasing a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying for too long. In the days that followed, word got around. Ryan lost the promotion, the new woman wanted nothing to do with him, and even his friends were side-eyeing him with raised eyebrows and half-truth whispers. But none of that mattered as much as the shift happening inside me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't mourning what could have been. I was rediscovering myself, confident, grounded, whole. And for the first time in a long while, I felt proud. Proud of walking away. Proud of choosing myself. Proud of refusing to beg for a man who didn't know what to do with loyalty. And as I stepped into this new life, one thing was clear. I wasn't the one who lost that day. He was.